In my world, everything is a data point. I am a risk analyst, which means I spend my days staring into the void of the future and trying to quantify the unknown. I look at patterns, I calculate probabilities, and I find the cracks in facades before they collapse. Insurance companies pay me a small fortune to tell them exactly when a bridge will fail or how likely it is that a seemingly healthy corporation will go bankrupt within 5 years. I am paid to be professional, cold, and right. I never thought I would have to apply those same cold metrics to the woman I love. The house in Austin was my masterpiece of logic. It was a sprawling, modern structure of glass, steel, and white stone, tucked away in a gated community where the lawns are groomed to the exact same height and the silence is so heavy it feels physical. I had integrated every possible smart technology into the walls. I could monitor the temperature of the wine cellar from a hotel in London. I could see how many times the refrigerator was opened or how much water was used in the guest suite. To most people, this was luxury. To me, it was a data stream. It was a way to ensure that my world remained in a state of perfect equilibrium. The equilibrium broke on a Tuesday in July. The Texas heat was a shimmering wall outside, but inside, the air conditioning hummed at a steady 68 degrees. I had returned from a business trip to Dallas 3 hours earlier than planned. I didn't call ahead. I didn't want to disturb Sarah, who was likely busy preparing for her next gallery opening. I parked my car a block away and walked, a strange impulse I couldn't quite explain. Perhaps my subconscious had already detected the anomaly before my conscious mind was ready to accept it. When I entered the foyer, the house felt different. Houses have a certain resonance when they are inhabited by specific people. The air has a weight and a scent that is familiar. But as I stepped onto the polished marble, I felt a vibration that didn't belong. It was a subtle shift in the atmosphere, like a note played slightly out of tune. I stood in the hallway, listening. The house was quiet, yet there was a lingering warmth that shouldn't have been there. I walked toward the master suite. My footsteps were silent on the thick rugs. I noticed the first anomaly near the door to the primary bathroom. The humidity level in the hallway was slightly elevated. My phone buzzed in my pocket. The smart home app was sending a notification that the master bathroom's ventilation system was running at maximum capacity to clear steam. Sarah never took mid-afternoon showers. She was a morning person, precise and scheduled. I opened the bedroom door. The bed was made, the pillows fluffed to their usual architectural perfection. But there was a faint indentation on the duvet, a small curve that suggested someone had been sitting there recently. I walked into the bathroom. The air was thick and smelled of expensive soap and something else. It was a sharp, masculine scent with notes of sandalwood and cold iron. It wasn't my cologne, and it certainly wasn't Sarah's floral perfume. I looked at the shower. The frosted glass door was still beaded with moisture. I ran my finger along the tile. It was warm. I checked the digital display on the shower wall. It showed that the water had been running for 22 minutes, ending only 6 minutes before I walked through the front door. Sarah was in the kitchen now. I could hear the faint clinking of a glass. If she had just finished a 20-minute shower, she would be in a robe, her hair wet. I walked out to the kitchen. Sarah was standing by the island, pouring herself a glass of chilled white wine. She looked stunning, as always, in a silk blouse and tailored trousers. Her hair was perfectly dry. Her makeup was flawless. She looked at me and didn't flinch. She gave me a warm, practiced smile that I had once found comforting but now looked like a mask. "Mark, you're home early," she said, her voice smooth and melodic. "I didn't expect you until tonight." "The flight was moved up," I replied, watching her eyes. I am an expert at reading micro-expressions. I look for the split-second hesitation, the dilation of pupils, the slight tension in the jaw. She was calm, but her hand gripped the wine glass a fraction too tightly. "You look refreshed," I said, stepping closer. "I noticed you were using the master shower." She didn't miss a beat. "Oh, I had a bit of a headache earlier. I thought the steam might help. I just got out and did a quick blow-dry." "Why do you ask?" I looked at her hair. It was styled in a way that would take at least 30 minutes with a professional dryer. The timeline didn't add up. The water stopped 6 minutes ago. There was no physical way she could be standing here, fully dressed and styled, in that window of time. I felt a cold sensation in my chest, a logical realization that my wife was lying to me. I see, I said. I think I'll go lie down for a bit. The trip was draining. She nodded, her smile never wavering. Of course, darling. I'll be in the study if you need me. I went back to the master suite and closed the door. I didn't lie down. I sat at my desk and opened my laptop. I accessed the back-end logs of the house. I am a man of evidence, not emotion. I needed to see the numbers. I pulled up the water usage for the last month. The pattern was undeniable. Every Tuesday and Thursday, between 2 and 4 in the afternoon, while I was at the office or traveling, the water usage in the master bathroom spiked. It wasn't just a shower, it was a deluge. Someone was spending a significant amount of time in that bathroom. I checked the motion sensors. They showed movement in the foyer, then the bedroom, and then a long period of stillness in the bathroom area. I felt like I was looking at a crime scene. But the crime wasn't a robbery or a physical assault. It was the systematic dismantling of my trust. I looked at the security camera logs for the front door. They had been manually paused or looped during those specific hours. Sarah had the access codes. She knew how the system worked. She thought she was being clever by using the technology one built against me. But she forgot one thing. I designed the redundancies. I bypassed the primary interface and accessed the hidden server in the basement that recorded raw data from the external perimeter sensors. These sensors didn't use cameras. They used LiDAR to detect shapes and movement. It was a system I had installed to detect intruders in the yard. I scrolled back to today at 1:45 p.m. A tall figure, approximately 6 feet 2 inches, walked up the side path, avoiding the main camera's field of vision. The figure entered through the side door to the garage. At 2:54 p.m., just minutes before I arrived, the same figure left. He was moving quickly, his head down. I couldn't see his face, but I could see his gait. He moved with an arrogant stride, the kind of walk that belonged to someone who spent a lot of time being looked at. I sat in the dark for a long time. The sun began to set, casting long, orange shadows across the room. I thought about our wedding 5 years ago. I thought about the promises we made. I realized then that our marriage wasn't a partnership. It was a contract that she had breached. In my profession, when a contract is breached, you don't get angry. You don't scream. You look for the liquidation clause. You look for a way to minimize your losses and maximize the penalty for the other party. I needed to know who he was. I began to cross-reference the timing of the visits with Sarah's social calendar. It didn't take long. Every time the visitor appeared, Sarah had recently returned from the downtown athletic club or the Contemporary Art Center. I started searching for men in her circle who fit the physical profile. I found him on an Instagram page for a local high-end fitness brand, Julian West. He was a fitness model and an aspiring actor. He was younger than me, with a jawline that looked like it was carved from granite and a head of thick, dark hair that he clearly spent a fortune maintaining. He was the kind of man who viewed his body as his primary asset. He was vanity personified. I looked at a photo of him standing in front of a mirror, a smug grin on his face. He was wearing a watch that looked familiar. I zoomed in. It was a vintage Patek Philippe. I checked my own dresser. My father's watch, which I kept in a velvet-lined box, was gone. The betrayal wasn't just emotional, it was material. They were mocking me in my own home, using my things, laughing at the predictable husband who was too busy with his spreadsheets to notice the wolf in the house. I felt a surge of something hot and dark in my veins, but I suppressed it. Anger is a volatile variable. It leads to mistakes. I needed a plan that was as precise as a surgical strike. I needed to wait, to observe, and to prepare. Over the next week, I became a ghost in my own home. I was polite, I was attentive, and I was entirely observant. I noticed how Sarah would glance at her phone and smile a certain way. I noticed how she would insist I take the later flight or stay an extra night in New York. I agreed to everything. I gave her all the space she needed to hang herself. I started a file on my encrypted drive. I titled it Project Equilibrium. I installed a pinhole camera in the one place they felt safe, the master bathroom. I didn't put it in the bedroom. I didn't want to see what happened there. I only wanted to see the mechanics of their deception. I wanted to see the moment he hid. I watched the first recording on a Thursday afternoon from a coffee shop 3 miles away. I saw Julian enter the bedroom. He was wearing my robe. He looked comfortable, like he owned the place. Sarah was with him, laughing. They talked about me. He's so focused on his charts. He wouldn't notice if I painted the house neon pink, Sarah said, her voice dripping with a casual cruelty that felt like a blade between my ribs. Julian laughed, running a hand through his hair. He's a provider, Sarah. That's his job. He provides the house, the wine, and the privacy for us to enjoy them. I watched as the doorbell rang. It was a delivery I had scheduled specifically to test their reaction. I saw the practice panic. Julian didn't run for the door or the closet. He grabbed his clothes and stepped into the large walk-in shower. He pulled the frosted glass shut and stood there, perfectly still. Sarah checked her reflection, smoothed her hair, and walked out to answer the door. It was a routine. The shower was his sanctuary, his hiding spot. The frosted glass was thick enough to hide his features, but let enough light through that he could see if anyone entered the room. It was the perfect flaw in my house's security. I leaned back in my chair, the light from the laptop reflecting in my glasses. I had the data. I had the pattern. Now, I needed the catalyst. I began to think about Julian. What was his greatest fear? For a man like him, it wasn't poverty or loneliness. It was the loss of his perceived perfection. He lived for the camera. He lived for the admiration of strangers. If he lost his looks, he lost his utility. He was a house of cards built on a foundation of vanity. And Sarah? Her fear was the loss of status. She loved the prestige of being Mrs. Mark Stevens. She loved the gallery, the donations, the influence. She had spent years cultivating an image of a sophisticated, loyal wife. I began to research chemical compositions. I spent hours on professional forums for dermatologists and cosmetic chemists. I looked for something specific, something that would be undetectable when mixed with a high-end shampoo, something that would work slowly, penetrating the follicles over the course of a few applications. I found it, a professional-grade depilatory agent used in clinical settings, designed to be odorless and colorless. When mixed in the right concentration with a heavy, protein-based conditioner, it wouldn't cause a burn or an immediate reaction. It would simply weaken the structure of the hair at the root. I ordered the components through a series of shell accounts and had them delivered to a secure locker. I spent my late nights in the garage, which I had converted into a temporary lab. I was careful. I used a precision scale to measure the ratios. I tested it on a sample of human hair I had obtained. The results were mathematically perfect. After 3 exposures of 5 minutes each, the hair would simply detach. I waited for the right moment. I knew they had a big event coming up. Julian had a major shoot for a national fitness magazine, and Sarah was hosting the annual arts gala. It was the pinnacle of their social season. It was the moment they would be most exposed. On Monday, I replaced their expensive, imported shampoo and conditioner with my custom blend. I did it with the steady hand of a man who was simply correcting an error in a ledger. I felt no guilt. I felt the same satisfaction an engineer feels when he fixes a structural weakness. I watched them on the camera that afternoon. Julian used the shower. He spent a long time lathering his hair, admiring himself in the mirror through the steam. Sarah joined him. They were happy. They were celebrating their secret victory over the man who provided everything for them. I sat in my study, listening to the silence of the house. I knew that the process had begun. The chemical reaction was invisible, but it was inevitable. I looked at the calendar. The gala was in 4 days. That night, Sarah came into the study. She leaned over and kissed my cheek. "You've been working so hard lately, Mark. You should take a break. Why don't you come to the gala with me on Friday? It would mean a lot to the board. I looked up at her, my expression neutral. I wouldn't miss it for the world, Sarah. I think Friday will be a night we both remember for a very long time. She smiled, oblivious to the double meaning. You're so sweet. I'm going to head to bed. Don't stay up too late. I watched her walk away. I thought about the thousands of hours I'd spent building this life for us. I thought about the sacrifices I had made. All of it had been treated as an inconvenience by her. She wanted the life, but she didn't want the man who made it possible. I opened my journal of anomalies. I made a final entry. Probability of total system failure, 100%. Estimated time of impact, 96 hours. I closed the laptop and sat in the dark. The house hummed around me, a machine of my own making. I was no longer the victim of a betrayal. I was the architect of a consequence. Tuesday came and went. I watched the logs. The water usage was consistent. They were using the product. I noticed Julian scratching his head a few times on the camera, a slight irritation perhaps, but he dismissed it. He was too busy practicing his poses for the magazine shoot. Wednesday was the second exposure. I saw Sarah complaining about her hair feeling thin or brittle. She blamed the Texas water. She told Julian she needed to find a better salon. He laughed and told her she was beautiful as always. He was focused on his own reflection, preening like a peacock. Thursday was the final dose. I stayed at a hotel that night, claiming another last-minute trip. I wanted to be away from the blast radius. I wanted them to have one last night of undisturbed confidence. I watched the feed from my phone. They were in the master bathroom again. The steam rose, the water flowed, and the trap was finally set. I woke up on Friday morning feeling a strange sense of peace. The air in my hotel room was cold and sterile. I dressed in my best suit. I polished my shoes until they shone like black glass. I checked my bank accounts. The transfers were complete. Most of our liquid assets had been moved to accounts she couldn't touch, a process I had started months ago under the guise of tax-efficient investing. I drove back to the house in the afternoon. The sun was high and brutal. I pulled into the driveway and saw Sarah's car. Everything looked normal, but I knew that inside, the structural integrity of their world was about to give way. I walked into the house. It was quiet, too quiet. I headed toward the master suite. As I approached, I heard a sound. It wasn't a conversation. It was a low, whimpering noise, followed by a sharp, panicked intake of breath. I pushed the door open. The bathroom was a mess. There were towels scattered everywhere. Sarah was standing in front of the mirror, her hands over her mouth. She was wearing her gala dress, a stunning emerald green silk. But her hair, the thick, blonde mane she was so proud of, was gone in patches. Large, jagged sections of her scalp were visible. Clumps of hair were stuck to the silk of her dress like dead spiders. Julian was sitting on the edge of the tub. He was unrecognizable. His head, once his pride and joy, was a disaster of uneven stubble and smooth skin. He looked aged, sickly, and utterly broken. He was holding a clump of his own dark hair in his hand, staring at it with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. I stood in the doorway, my hands in my pockets. I didn't say anything. I just watched. "Mark!" Sarah screamed, turning to see me. "Something is wrong. The water. The shampoo. Look at us." I walked into the room, stepping over a pile of wet towels. I looked at the shower door, then at the bottles on the ledge. "It looks like a significant loss of follicles," I said, my voice calm and analytical. "I'd say you've lost about 70% of your coverage." "What did you do?" Julian hissed, his voice trembling. "You did this." I looked at him. I looked at the man who had hidden in my shower, who had worn my father's watch, who had laughed at my expense. "I didn't do anything, Julian. I simply adjusted the environment. You were a guest in my home, and you overstayed your welcome. You took things that didn't belong to you, and now you're losing things you thought were permanent. It's a very simple equation." Sarah was sobbing now, her hands clawing at what was left of her hair. "My gala, the opening. I can go like this. I look like a monster." I checked my watch. "The gala starts in 2 hours. Sarah, I think you should probably cancel." And while you're at it, you should probably call a lawyer. I've already filed the papers. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, silver thumb drive. This contains the recordings of your headaches, Sarah. It contains the LiDAR logs of Julian's visits. And it contains the forensic accounting of the money you took from the gallery. I think the board will find it very interesting. I turned to Julian. As for you, I've already sent the footage of you hiding in the shower to your agency. I think they'll find the before and after photos quite compelling for their new campaign on the importance of integrity. I walked out of the bathroom. I didn't look back. I could hear them arguing, their voices rising in a shrill, desperate chorus of blame. The love they thought they had was already evaporating, replaced by the bitter reality of their own ruin. I went to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of the wine Sarah had been drinking on the day I first suspected. It was crisp and cold. I sat at the island and looked out at the perfectly manicured lawn. The house felt right again. The resonance was back to its original frequency. The anomalies had been purged. I took a sip of the wine and opened my laptop. I had a new project to start, a new life to analyze, a new set of data points to organize. The price of deceit is always high, but the cost of maintaining a lie is even higher. I had simply balanced the books. As I sat there, the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the Texas sky in shades of deep red and bruised purple. I felt nothing but a quiet, professional satisfaction. The first chapter of my new life was beginning, and for the first time in a long time, the future looked exactly as I had calculated it to be. The process of analyzing a breach is never about the immediate shock. It is about the cold, methodical reconstruction of the failure points. In the days following my initial discovery, I lived a double life that required more calculation than any insurance portfolio I had ever managed. I had to remain the predictable husband, the man who looked at the world through the lens of spreadsheets and safety margins, while secretly transforming our sanctuary into a laboratory of observation. The outline of my life had changed, and I needed to map the new, jagged terrain before I could move. I began by deepening the digital architecture of the house. Our home was already smart, but I made it sentient. I spent my evenings in my study, ostensibly working on the Q3 risk projections for a coastal development firm, but my screens were filled with something far more personal. I bypassed the standard user interface of our security system and began installing a secondary layer of invisible watchers. I didn't just want video. Video can be misleading. I wanted data. I installed high-precision sensors that measured carbon dioxide levels, humidity, and the microscopic fluctuations in the home's electrical load. Every person has a biological signature. We exhale a certain amount of CO2. We consume a specific number of watts when we turn on a light, and we leave a trail of heat behind us. By the third day, I had calibrated the system to recognize my signature and Sarah's. Anything else, any spike in oxygen consumption, or any movement in a room that registered a weight over 190 pounds, would trigger a silent notification on my encrypted device. The first time the notification popped up while I was at the office, I felt a strange, detached curiosity. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The sensor in the guest wing had registered a weight of 195 pounds on the floorboards. I opened the feed from a pinhole camera I had hidden inside a decorative smoke detector. There he was, Julian West. He didn't just enter the house. He inhabited it with a galling sense of entitlement. I watched him walk into the kitchen and open a bottle of my 20-year-old scotch. He didn't use a glass. He drank straight from the bottle before wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, the hand that was wearing my father's vintage watch. I sat in my ergonomic chair at the office, surrounded by the hum of servers and the quiet chatter of colleagues, and watched a stranger treat my life like a discarded set of clothes. He went to the master suite. A few minutes later, Sarah arrived. The cameras I had placed were positioned to capture their faces, their expressions, and most importantly, their words. I needed to understand the why behind the betrayal to properly calculate the how of the response. I watched as they sat on the edge of our bed. The audio was crystal clear. Sarah looked tired, but when she looked at Julian, her face transformed into something I hadn't seen in years. A mixture of excitement and a desperate, almost hungry validation. Is he still clueless? Julian asked, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that sounded like it belonged in a commercial for expensive cars. Mark? Sarah laughed, and the sound felt like a cold draft in the room. He's more than clueless, Julian. He's blinded by his own arrogance. He thinks because he can predict the weather or a market crash, he understands everything. He looks at me like I'm just another asset in his portfolio. Stable, depreciating slightly over time, but reliable. He doesn't see a woman. He sees a checkbox. Julian leaned back, running a hand through that thick, dark hair that would soon be his undoing. He provides well, though. This house is a palace. It's a cage, Sarah snapped, though her eyes remained on him. A very expensive, very shiny cage. But don't worry, the door is going to open soon. I've been talking to the legal consultant I told you about. If we play this right, I won't just walk away with my dignity. I'll walk away with the keys to the kingdom. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the office air conditioning. I zoomed in on her face. There was a coldness there, a strategic calculation that mirrored my own. I realized then that I wasn't just dealing with an unfaithful spouse. I was dealing with a predator. That night, I waited until Sarah was asleep. Her breathing was rhythmic and shallow. I slipped out of bed and went to her vanity. I didn't look for letters or jewelry. I looked for her tablet. I knew her password. It was the date we bought the house, a piece of irony that wasn't lost on me. I navigated to her hidden cloud storage. I am an analyst. I know where people hide the things they think are deleted. I found a folder titled Future Planning. Inside were hundreds of documents. There were photos of me, taken at odd angles, that made me look disheveled or angry. There were logs of incidents that had never happened, notes about me losing my temper, throwing things, or exhibiting erratic behavior. She was building a dossier. She wasn't just planning a divorce. She was planning a character assassination. She intended to claim that the stress of my job had caused a psychological breakdown, rendering me a danger to her and myself. In the state of Texas, such a claim, if backed by evidence and a sympathetic witness like a friend, presumably Julian, could be used to challenge our prenuptial agreement and secure a massive settlement, or even a permanent claim to the estate. I sat on the floor of the darkened room, the glow of the tablet reflecting in my eyes. The betrayal was absolute. She wasn't just taking another man into our bed. She was trying to take my mind, my reputation, and my future. She wanted to erase the man I was and replace him with a caricature of a broken, unstable husband. The risk was no longer just financial. It was existential. I spent the rest of the night in the basement, in a small corner I had partitioned off as a workshop. I didn't work on wood or electronics. I worked on chemistry. My plan for the shampoo was already in motion, but after seeing her dossier, I knew the hair loss was only the first phase. It was the aesthetic strike, the blow to their vanity. But I needed a legal strike to counter her future planning. I began to study the laws regarding digital privacy and consent in Texas. I knew that my hidden cameras were a gray area, but I also knew that if I could prove she was committing fraud, specifically financial fraud against the gallery and a conspiracy to commit perjury, the privacy of those recordings would be secondary to the criminal evidence they contained. I started a counter dossier. I titled it The Reconstruction of Truth. I spent hours researching the chemical company that produced the professional-grade depilatory agent. I needed to ensure that the reaction was subtle. If it happened all at once, they would suspect foul play immediately. It had to look like a medical mystery, a sudden, unexplained reaction to stress or an environmental factor. I calculated the exact pH balance of our tap water and how it would interact with the sulfur-based compounds in the depilatory. I was no longer just a husband. I was an observer of a failing system. I watched them through the screens. I saw Julian using my gym equipment, sweating on the machines I had bought, and then heading to the shower. I saw him using the premium skin creams I had purchased for Sarah, slathering them on his face with a smug grin. He was so beautiful in a classic, unthreatening way. He was a man who had never had to work for anything other than his physique. Everything else was handed to him because people liked looking at him. I realized that by taking his hair, I wasn't just changing his appearance. I was stripping him of his social currency. Without those locks, without that perfect, curated image, he would be nothing more than a moderately fit man with no skills and a fading reputation. And Sarah, her vanity was tied to her influence. She moved through the high society circles of Austin like a queen. If she appeared at the gala with her hair falling out in clumps, the whispers would start. They wouldn't be whispers of sympathy. They would be whispers of what happened to her. And is she sick? In her world, weakness was a scent that attracted sharks. I watched a recording from Thursday afternoon. They were in the living room this time. You should see the look on his face when I tell him I'm going to the gallery late, Sarah said, sipping a glass of wine. He just nods and goes back to his numbers. He's so pathetic. He thinks he's so smart, but he can't even see what's right in front of him. Julian laughed, leaning into her. He's just a provider, babe. Some guys are built to lead, and some are built to pay the bills. I paused the video on Julian's face. I didn't feel anger. I felt a profound sense of clarity. They viewed my stability as a weakness. They viewed my provision as an invitation to exploit. It was a classic miscalculation of risk. They assumed that because I was quiet, I was passive. They assumed that because I followed the rules, I was bound by them. They didn't understand that the rules are what I use to build a cage. I began to look into the gallery's finances. If Sarah was planning to frame me, she likely had her own vulnerabilities. People who are greedy in their personal lives are rarely honest in their professional ones. I accessed the public tax filings of the Contemporary Art Center and compared them with the sales Sarah bragged about at dinner. The numbers didn't add up. There were several donations from offshore accounts that coincided with the purchase of high-end pieces that never appeared on the gallery's public inventory. She was flipping art, buying pieces with black money, holding them, and then selling them for a profit that went into her private accounts. It was a sophisticated form of money laundering, likely something she had learned from the high-net-worth individuals she socialized with. I had her. I spent Friday morning in the city, meeting with a private investigator who specialized in discreet corporate forensics. I didn't tell him I was investigating my wife. I told him I was doing due diligence on a potential merger with a gallery-owned entity. I gave him the account numbers I had discovered. By noon, he called me back. Mark, this isn't just a discrepancy. This is a systematic siphoning of funds. Someone is moving large amounts of cash through ghost auctions. If the IRS gets a whiff of this, the whole place will be padlocked by sunset. Thank you, I said, my voice steady. Keep the file open. I'll let you know when to proceed. I drove back to the house, stopping at a specialized chemical supply store on the way. I bought a few more ingredients for my laboratory. I needed to ensure that this shampoo was perfectly balanced for the final application. When I got home, Sarah was in the foyer, looking at herself in the large, ornate mirror. She was wearing a new pair of diamond earrings I hadn't bought her. You're home early again, she said, her voice sounding a bit sharper than usual. Is everything okay at the office? Perfectly fine, I said, walking past her. Just clearing some things up before the weekend. You look lovely, Sarah. Are those new? She touched the earrings, a momentary flicker of hesitation in her eyes. Oh, these? Just some costume jewelry I picked up at the boutique. I wanted something a bit more modern for the gala. I nodded. They suit you. They have a certain sparkle. I went up to the master bathroom. I looked at the bottles of shampoo and conditioner. The levels had dropped. They were using it. The depilatory was already beginning to weaken the protein bonds in their hair. It wouldn't be long now. I sat on the edge of the tub, the same spot where Julian would sit just a few days later, clutching his falling hair in despair. I looked at the frosted glass of the shower. It was a beautiful piece of design, meant to provide privacy while letting in light. It was the perfect metaphor for our marriage, a beautiful facade that hid a hollow center. I thought about the future planning folder on her tablet. I thought about the photos she had taken of me, the lies she was preparing to tell a judge. I felt a surge of cold, analytical power. I wasn't just defending myself. I was re-establishing the equilibrium of my world. In my profession, we talk about the black swan, an event that is unpredictable, has a massive impact, and is often inappropriately rationalized after the fact with the benefit of hindsight. To Sarah and Julian, I was the black swan. I was the variable they never saw coming. I was the collapse they couldn't predict. I spent the rest of the evening being the perfect husband. I listened to Sarah talk about the gala. I listened to her talk about the artist she was promoting. I even laughed at her jokes. I was a master of the mask because I'd spent my life studying the masks of others. As we went to bed, she turned to me and said, "You know, Mark, sometimes I think we don't spend enough time just being together. After the gala, maybe we should take a trip, just the two of us." I looked at her in the dim light of the bedroom. I knew that she was saying this to bolster her evidence of being a caring wife, something she could use later to show how hard she tried to save me during my breakdown. "I think a trip is a wonderful idea, Sarah," I said. "A fresh start is exactly what we need." I closed my eyes and waited for her breathing to slow. In my mind, I was already calculating the final steps. The chemistry was ready. The legal evidence was secured. The digital watchers were silent and vigilant. Tomorrow would be the third day of exposure. The irritation would begin. They would start to notice a few extra strands in the brush, a little more hair in the drain. They would dismiss it as stress. They would tell each other it was nothing. They were so confident in their beauty, so sure of their power over me. They didn't realize that beauty is a fragile thing, and power is a calculation that can be solved by anyone with the right data. I lay there in the dark, the silent architect of their downfall, and for the first time in months, I slept soundly. I knew that the system was working exactly as intended. The failure points had been identified, the risks had been mitigated, and the price of deceit was about to be collected in full. I woke up the next morning to the sound of the shower running. I stayed in bed, listening to the water hit the tiles. I knew Julian wasn't there yet. It was too early, but Sarah was. She was using the product. She was washing away the last of her security, one lather at a time. When she came out of the bathroom, she was wrapping her hair in a towel. She looked at me and smiled. "Morning, sleepyhead. I feel like today is going to be a great day." I sat up and returned her smile. "I couldn't agree more, Sarah. Today is the day everything starts to become clear." She didn't notice the double meaning. She never did. She was too busy looking at her own reflection, unaware that the image she loved so much was already beginning to dissolve. I went down to the kitchen and started a pot of coffee. I checked my phone. The LiDAR sensor on the garage door had just been triggered. Julian was arriving. He was early today. Perhaps he was excited about the magazine shoot. I took my coffee out to the patio and watched the sun rise over the Texas hills. The air was warm and smelled of cedar and dust. It was a beautiful morning. Inside the house, the unseen guest was moving toward the master suite. Sarah was waiting for him. They would have their morning together, and then they would both use the shower. They would both use the shampoo. I sipped my coffee and felt the calm satisfaction of a man who has accounted for every variable. The architecture of the trap was complete. All that was left was to wait for the physics of the situation to take over. In the world of risk analysis, we have a saying, "The trend is your friend until the bend at the end." Sarah and Julian were enjoying the trend. They were riding the high of their deception, convinced that it would last forever. But I could see the bend. It was right there, just a few hours away, hidden behind a bottle of expensive shampoo and a frosted glass door. I finished my coffee and went back inside. I had a few more things to prepare. I needed to make sure this smart home was ready to record the climax of the performance. I needed to make sure the evidence was organized and ready for delivery. By the time I left for the office, Julian was already in the shower. I could see the steam rising from the vents on the side of the house. I could hear the faint hum of the ventilation system working at maximum capacity. I drove away with a light heart. The predictable husband was going to work, and the world was exactly as it should be. The data was solid. The probabilities were in my favor, and the reconstruction of my life was well underway. I spent the afternoon at a local library, far from the prying eyes of my colleagues. I didn't want any digital trail of my activities on the corporate network. I used a public terminal to finalize the reconstruction of Truth file. I added the latest recordings, the financial logs, and a detailed timeline of the betrayal. I also drafted a letter to the gallery's board of directors. It was a masterpiece of professional concern. I expressed my discovery of the financial discrepancies while reviewing our joint tax returns and my heartbreak at realizing that my wife might be involved in something so illegal. It was the perfect countermove to her mental instability plot. I wasn't the broken one. I was the protective husband trying to make sense of his wife's criminal behavior. I looked at the clock. It was 4 p.m. The gala was only 24 hours away. The magazine shoot for Julian was tomorrow morning. The timing was perfect. I drove back toward the neighborhood, but I didn't go home. I stayed at a small park nearby, watching the sunset. I felt a sense of anticipation that was almost electric. This wasn't about revenge. It was about the restoration of order. It was about proving that in a world of chaos and lies, the truth, and those who can calculate it, will always prevail. I checked the house cameras one last time before heading back. Julian was gone. Sarah was sitting in the living room, reading a magazine and sipping tea. She looked calm. She looked beautiful. But I noticed something. On the back of her emerald green silk robe, there was a single, long strand of blonde hair. And then another. The bend had arrived. I put my phone away and started the car. I was going home to my wife. I was going home to be the man she thought I was one last time. As I pulled into the driveway, I saw the lights of the house shining through the trees. It looked like a postcard, the perfect American home, the perfect American life. But I knew better. I knew that inside those walls, the foundations were crumbling. I knew that the air was thick with the scent of an impending disaster. And I knew that I was the only one who knew how to survive it. I walked through the front door and called out, "Sarah, I'm home." She came into the hallway, her smile as bright as ever. "Welcome back, darling. How was your day?" I looked at her, and for a fleeting second, I felt a pang of something like regret. But then I remembered the future planning folder. I remembered the way she laughed at my predictability. I remembered Julian drinking my scotch and wearing my father's watch. The regret vanished, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. "My day was excellent, Sarah," I said, hanging up my jacket. "Truly excellent. I think we're in for a very interesting weekend." She laughed, a light, tinkling sound. "You're always so cryptic, Mark. Come, I've started dinner. Let's talk about the gala." I followed her into the kitchen, the architect following his creation into the heart of the structure. The trap was set, the variables were locked, and the countdown had begun. Tomorrow, the world would see them for what they really were. Tomorrow, the predictable husband would become the author of their reality. And as I sat across from her at the dinner table, listening to her talk about the future we would never have, I knew that the price of deceit was about to be paid in full, and I was the only one who knew the exact amount of the debt. The scent of cedar and high-end floor wax greeted me every morning, a fragrance of success that now felt like the sterile air of a hospital corridor. In my world, consistency is the only currency that matters. If a system remains consistent, it can be managed. If it fluctuates, it must be corrected. For years, I believed my marriage was a stable asset, a fixed point in a world of variables. I was wrong. It was a liability, a sinking fund of lies that had been draining my emotional and financial reserves while I was busy looking at the horizon. Thursday morning arrived with a particular kind of clarity. The Texas sun was already pushing against the triple-paned glass of the bedroom, a relentless force trying to find a crack in the insulation. I sat in the armchair by the window, watching Sarah sleep. She looked serene, her breathing a perfect, rhythmic sine wave. It was the face of a woman who felt entirely secure in her deception. To her, I was a predictable element, a piece of furniture that provided comfort but required no real attention. I was the silent partner in a firm she intended to liquidate. I thought about the folder on my encrypted drive, the reconstruction of truth. It was growing larger every hour. I had the financial records from the gallery, the LiDAR logs of every time Julian entered the garage, and the high-definition recordings of their whispered plans. I was no longer a husband. I was a forensic auditor of a failing life. I stood up and walked silently into the master bathroom. This was ground zero. This was where the physical manifestation of my response would take place. I looked at the bottles on the shelf. They were beautiful, minimalist designs, the kind of products that cost more than a mid-range television. I had spent the previous night carefully transferring my custom blend into the genuine bottles. The viscosity was perfect. The scent was masked by a hint of expensive bergamot oil I had added to match the original product. I knew the chemistry. The depilatory agent I had chosen was a sophisticated enzyme-based compound. It didn't burn the skin. That would be too obvious, too immediate. Instead, it worked by gently breaking down the disulfide bonds in the hair shaft right at the follicular opening. It was a slow-motion collapse. The first application would cause minor thinning. The second would lead to noticeable shedding. The third, the one they would both take today, would be the tipping point. I heard Sarah stir in the bedroom. I quickly stepped out of the bathroom and sat back in my chair, opening a book on risk management. "You're up early," she murmured, her voice thick with sleep. She stretched, and I saw the grace that had once captivated me. Now it just looked like the movement of a well-oiled machine. "I had a lot on my mind," I said, not looking up from the page. "The Q4 projections are looking volatile. I need to get ahead of the curve." She sat up, pushing her blonde hair back. "You always worry too much, Mark. The world isn't going to end if a few numbers are off. It's not the numbers I worry about, Sarah. It's the things the numbers represent. Integrity, stability, the things you can't replace once they're gone." She paused, a flicker of something. Was it suspicion or just boredom? Crossing her face. "You're being very philosophical this morning. Maybe you need more coffee." "Maybe," I agreed. She walked into the bathroom, and a moment later, I heard the sound of the shower. I sat perfectly still, my heart rate steady at 64 beats per minute. I could hear the hum of the ventilation system. I knew exactly what was happening behind that frosted glass. She was lathering her hair with the product I had prepared. She was massaging it into her scalp, thinking about the gala, thinking about her future planning, thinking about how she had outsmarted the man sitting 10 feet away. When she came out, she was wrapped in her robe, her hair bundled in a towel. She looked refreshed. "I feel so much better. That new shampoo you bought is wonderful. My hair feels so light." "I'm glad you like it," I said. "I wanted to make sure you were at your best for the gala tomorrow. It's a big night." "It is," she said, sitting at her vanity. She began to unwrap the towel. I watched her in the mirror's reflection. As she ran a comb through her hair, I saw it. A few more strands than usual stayed in the teeth of the comb. She didn't notice yet. She was looking at her skin, applying serums and creams with practiced precision. "Julian called me yesterday," she said casually, testing me. "He mentioned he might be at the gala. He's doing some work for one of the sponsors." "Julian West?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. "The fitness model?" I didn't realize he was into the arts. "Oh, he's trying to broaden his horizons," she said, her eyes fixed on her own image. "He's quite ambitious in his own way." "Ambitious is a good word for it," I said. "Though ambition without a foundation usually ends in a fall. Like Icarus." She laughed. "You and your metaphors, Mark. Sometimes I think you live in a library instead of the real world." "The real world is just a library that hasn't been cataloged yet," I replied. I left for the office shortly after. I didn't go to my desk. I went to a small private office I had rented under a different name a few blocks away. I needed a clean environment, away from the corporate network, to finalize the legal strike. The private investigator had sent over the final report on the gallery's finances. It was even worse than I had suspected. Sarah hadn't just been flipping art. She had been creating ghost sales to cover the fact that several high-value pieces had disappeared entirely. She was essentially running a high-end pawn shop for stolen assets, using the gallery's reputation as a shield. I began to compile the evidence into a digital presentation. I included the dates of the sales, the origin of the funds, and the lack of corresponding shipping records. Then, I added the LiDAR data showing Julian's car arriving at the warehouse she used as a private storage facility. They were partners in more than just the affair. They were partners in a criminal enterprise. I spent the afternoon drafting the anonymous tip to the art loss register and the local authorities. I timed it so the investigation would trigger on Monday morning, just after the social fallout of the gala had settled. I wanted the sequence of their destruction to be perfect. First, the loss of their vanity. Then, the loss of their social standing. And, finally, the loss of their freedom. At 2 p.m., my phone buzzed. It was the smart home notification. Julian had entered the house. I opened the feed. They were in the kitchen. "I have the shoot tomorrow morning," Julian was saying, his voice echoing in the marble-tiled room. "The magazine wants the sculpted look. I need to be perfect." "You are perfect," Sarah said, her voice dripping with an affection she never showed me. "And that new hair treatment Mark bought? It's amazing. My hair has never been this soft. You should use it before you go. It'll make your hair look incredible on camera." The analyst bought hair products. Julian laughed. "Maybe he's finally realizing he needs to compete." "He can't compete with you, Julian. He doesn't even know what game we're playing." I watched as they headed toward the master suite. I felt a cold, hard knot in my stomach, but I didn't look away. I watched as Julian entered the bathroom. I watched as he stepped into the shower. He spent a long time in there. He was vain, even when he was alone. He spent minutes massaging the conditioner into his scalp, his eyes closed as he imagined the fame and fortune that awaited him. He didn't know that the chemical bonds of his identity were dissolving in real time. When he stepped out, he looked at himself in the mirror, wiping the steam away. He ran his hand through his hair, styling it. He noticed a few hairs on his palm. He frowned, looking at them for a second, then shrugged and rinsed them off. He thought it was just the intensity of his workout, or perhaps a change in the weather. He was too confident to consider that he was being dismantled from the inside out. I closed the laptop. I had seen enough. I spent the rest of the day in a state of hyperfocus. I finalized the divorce papers with my attorney, ensuring that the infidelity clause was ironclad and supported by the digital evidence I had gathered. I also arranged for a moving company to be on standby for Saturday morning. I wanted every trace of her out of my house within 12 hours of the gala. I returned home around 6:30 p.m. The house was quiet. Sarah was in the living room, dressed in a silk slip, looking through a catalog of auction items. "Did you have a good day?" she asked, not looking up. "Productive," I said. "I think I finally managed to mitigate the risks I was worried about. Everything is back in balance." "That's good, Mark. You seem different lately, more focused." "Perspective changes things," I said. "I'm going to take a shower, and then maybe we can have an early dinner. We have a big day tomorrow." I went into the bathroom. I took the special bottles and replaced them with the original, untouched products. I didn't want any trace of the chemical mix left in the house when the fallout began. I washed the mixing containers I had used in the garage and disposed of the residue in a secure container I had brought from the office. During dinner, the tension was palpable, though Sarah seemed oblivious to it. She was talking about the people who would be at the gala, the donors she needed to impress, and the dress she was going to wear. "It's an emerald green silk," she said. "It took weeks to find the right shade. It's supposed to highlight my hair." "I'm sure it will be unforgettable," I said. I looked at her closely. The shedding hadn't become obvious yet, but I could see the subtle change. The volume was gone. Her hair looked limp, lacking its usual luster. Under the bright lights of the dining room, I could see the faint outline of her scalp through the fine strands. She would notice soon. Perhaps tonight, perhaps tomorrow morning. "Are you okay, Mark?" she asked, pausing with her fork halfway to her mouth. "You're staring." "Just admiring the view," I said. "You've put a lot of work into your appearance, Sarah. It's impressive." "Thank you," she said, smiling. "It's part of the job. In my world, image is everything." "I know," I said. "That's why I find it so fascinating." After dinner, she went to the bathroom to do her nightly routine. I sat in the dark living room, listening. I heard the sound of a brush hitting the counter. Then silence. Then the sound of the brush again, faster this time. She came out a few minutes later, her face pale. "Mark, do you think the water in this house is too hard? Or maybe the softener is broken?" "Why do you ask?" "My hair. It seems to be falling out more than usual. I just brushed it, and there was so much in the brush." "Look." She held out her hand. A small nest of blonde hair lay in her palm. I stood up and walked over to her, examining the hair with the cold curiosity of a scientist. "It could be stress, Sarah. You've been working very hard on this gala. Or perhaps it's a reaction to something. Have you tried any new products lately?" She looked confused. "Only that shampoo you bought. But it felt so good." "Maybe you should stop using it," I suggested. "I'll check the water softener in the morning. I'm sure it's nothing to worry about. A few hairs are normal this time of year." "It's not just a few, Mark. It feels thin." "You're just nervous about tomorrow," I said, putting a hand on her shoulder. "Go to sleep. Everything will look different in the morning." She nodded, though the anxiety was still visible in her eyes. She went to bed, and I followed shortly after. I lay there in the dark, listening to the house. I knew that Julian was probably experiencing the same thing. He would be waking up for his shoot tomorrow, and he would find a surprise on his pillow. Friday morning was the beginning of the end. I woke up at 6 a.m. Sarah was already in the bathroom. I heard a muffled cry, followed by the sound of something breaking. I walked to the door. "Sarah, is everything okay?" She opened the door, and for the first time, the mask was gone. Her eyes were wide with terror. She was holding a clump of hair that had come away in her hand when she tried to style it. There was a visible patch above her right ear, a smooth, pink circle of scalp. "Mark, look, what is happening to me?" I stepped into the room and looked at her. I felt a surge of satisfaction, but I kept my face neutral. "My God, Sarah, that looks serious. It looks like alopecia or a severe allergic reaction." "But I have the gala, the opening. I can't go like this." "We'll find a way," I said. "Maybe a stylist can hide it. Or a hat." "No, that wouldn't work for a gala." The phone on the counter buzzed. It was a text from Julian. I could see the preview on the screen. "Something is wrong. My hair is coming out in clumps. I had to cancel the shoot." "Sarah, what do we do?" Sarah saw the text at the same time I did. She grabbed the phone, her hands shaking. She looked at me, then at the phone, then back at me. "Did Julian, is he having this too?" she whispered. "Who is Julian?" I asked, my voice as cold as ice. She froze. The realization finally hit her. She looked at the bottles on the shelf, then at me. She saw the lack of surprise in my eyes. She saw the calm, analytical way I was watching her. She breathed. "You did this." "I don't know what you're talking about, Sarah," I said, stepping closer. "But I do know that Julian West just texted you about his hair falling out. That seems like a very strange coincidence, doesn't it? Unless, of course, you two have been sharing more than just ambition." She backed away, hitting the vanity. "You're insane. You poisoned the shampoo." "Poisoned? That's a very strong word. I simply introduced a variable that exposed the fragility of your world. You wanted a fresh start, Sarah. You wanted to open the cage. Well, here it is. The door is wide open." I walked over to the vanity and picked up her tablet. I opened the future planning folder and showed her the screen. "I found your dossier, Sarah. The lies about my mental health. The plan to steal the house and the assets. Did you really think I wouldn't see it? I'm a risk analyst. My entire life is built on seeing the things people try to hide." She was sobbing now, the clumps of hair falling onto her silk robe like dead leaves. "Mark, please. I was scared. We can talk about this." "There's nothing left to talk about," I said. "I've already sent the recordings of your conversations with Julian to my attorney. I've sent the financial records of your art flipping scheme to the board of the gallery. And I've sent a very interesting video to Julian's agency. The one where he talks about how clueless I am while he's drinking my scotch." I leaned in, my voice a whisper. "You thought I was a predictable element. You thought I was a provider you could exploit. But you forgot that the person who provides the system also controls it. You're not the queen of the gallery anymore, Sarah. You're just a woman with a ruined reputation and a very expensive dress she can't wear." I walked out of the room, leaving her standing in the wreckage of her vanity. I went downstairs and made a fresh pot of coffee. The silence of the house was now a comfortable thing. The unseen guest was gone. The lies were exposed. The system was back in equilibrium. I heard her upstairs, screaming at Julian on the phone, blaming him, blaming me, blaming the world. I heard her trying to call her stylist, her friends, her lawyer. But I knew it was too late. The alerts I had set up were already triggering. The ghost sales were being flagged. The agency was already reviewing the footage of Julian's arrogance. The social and professional collapse was happening at the speed of light. I sat at the kitchen island and opened my laptop. I had one more thing to do. I accessed the smart home settings and deleted the secondary layer of sensors. I didn't need them anymore. The observation period was over. I looked out at the backyard. The sun was fully up now, casting long, golden shadows across the grass. It was a beautiful day in Austin. I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. I wasn't the broken husband. I wasn't the victim of a betrayal. I was the architect of a new reality. I took a sip of my coffee and began to plan my next move. I had a house to sell, a life to rebuild, and a world of new variables to explore. Sarah came downstairs an hour later. She had a scarf wrapped around her head, and she was carrying a small suitcase. Her eyes were red and swollen. "I'm leaving," she said, her voice trembling. "I know," I said, not looking up from my screen. "The movers will be here at 8 a.m. tomorrow to take the rest of your things. I've already had the locks changed on the garage and the wine cellar. You have your car and your personal items. Everything else belongs to the estate until the court decides otherwise." "You're a monster," she spat. "No, Sada. I'm an analyst. I just gave you exactly what you deserved based on the data provided. You shouldn't be surprised. You should have checked the numbers." She turned and walked out the front door. I heard her car start and the tires screech as she pulled out of the driveway. I sat there for a long time, finishing my coffee. The house was mine again. The air was clear. I looked at the Journal of Anomalies on my desk. I picked up a pen and drew a single, clean line through the last entry. System restored. I stood up and went to the window. In the distance, I could see the towers of downtown Austin shimmering in the heat. The gala would go on tonight without Sarah Stevens. The gallery would face a scandal it might not survive. Julian West would become a cautionary tale of vanity and hubris. And I would be the man who saw it all coming. I walked into the foyer and looked at the large mirror. I saw a man who was calm, collected, and entirely in control. I saw a man who had survived a systemic failure and come out stronger on the other side. I adjusted my tie and headed out to my car. I had a meeting with a new client, a firm that was worried about the long-term risks of a merger. They wanted someone who could see the cracks before they appeared. They wanted someone who wasn't afraid to look at the truth, no matter how ugly it was. I smiled as I started the engine. "I think I'm exactly the man you're looking for," I whispered to the empty car. I drove away from the house, the sun on my back, the future of vast, unmapped territory of possibilities. The price of deceit had been paid, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't looking at the projections. I was living them. The first chapter of my life was over. The second had just begun, and this time, I was the only one with the access codes. The road ahead was clear, the variables were stable, and a master analyst was ready for whatever came next. The clock on my hotel bedside table displayed 10:15 in the morning. In the world of high-stakes risk assessment, timing is not merely a factor, it is the heartbeat of the entire operation. I sat in a high-backed leather chair, the kind designed for executives who need to make difficult decisions in comfort, and watched the data streams on my laptop. The hotel was a quiet, sterile environment, located just far enough from my home to provide a buffer, but close enough to monitor the signals. I was looking at the energy and water consumption logs for my house in real time. A significant spike in the master bathroom's water usage had occurred 30 minutes ago. The duration was long enough for 2 people. The temperature was set to a steady 102 degrees. The chemical reaction I had prepared was, at this very moment, interacting with the biological structures of the 2 people I had once trusted most. I poured myself a glass of water, watching the bubbles rise and dissipate. It was a perfect metaphor for the lives of Sarah and Julian. They had built a sparkling, effervescent existence on a foundation of air, and now the pressure was about to equalize. I checked the external LiDAR sensors. Julian's silver sports car was still in the driveway, tucked behind the privacy hedge. He was supposed to be at his magazine shoot by noon. He was likely taking one last shower to ensure his hair looked exactly as the stylist expected. He was a man who worshipped his own image, and today, that idol was going to crumble. I closed the laptop and dressed with a sense of ritual. I chose a charcoal gray suit, a white shirt with French cuffs, and a tie in a deep, understated blue. I wanted to look like the man I was, a professional, a protector of assets, an analyst of truth. I didn't feel the heat as I walked to my car. I felt only the cool, refreshing draft of a plan coming to fruition. I drove toward the neighborhood, maintaining the speed limit exactly. There was no need to rush. The laws of chemistry and the rules of the contract were doing the heavy lifting for me. As I pulled in my driveway, the silence of the street felt heavy, as if the neighborhood itself were holding its breath. I noticed a single delivery truck 2 houses down, the driver oblivious to the tectonic shift occurring inside my walls. I stepped out of the car and adjusted my cuffs. I could hear a sound coming from the upper floor. It wasn't a scream, not yet. It was a low, frantic murmuring, the sound of 2 people trying to rationalize the irrational. I entered through the front door. The foyer was immaculate, a testament to the life I had provided. I walked up the stairs, my shoes making a rhythmic, steady sound on the hardwood. I reached the master suite and pushed the door open. The bedroom was a mess of discarded clothes and expensive luggage. The door to the bathroom was ajar, and a thick plume of steam drifted out, smelling of the bergamot and sandalwood I had used to mask the catalyst. I walked into the bathroom. The scene was a masterpiece of poetic justice. Sarah was standing in front of the massive, lighted mirror, her hands trembling as they hovered near her head. She was wearing the emerald green silk dress she had planned to debut at the gala, but the zipper was only halfway up. Her hair, which had been a cascading wave of gold just yesterday, was now a jagged, patchy landscape. Large clumps of it lay on the white marble counter like discarded silk. Julian was sitting on the edge of the oversized tub, his head buried in his hands. His dark, thick hair, his most marketable feature, was scattered across the floor tiles. He looked like a man who had been stripped of his armor in the middle of a clearing. "It won't stop," Sarah whispered, her voice cracking. She didn't even look at me. Her eyes were locked on her own reflection, watching as another strand of hair slid down the side of her face and fell into the sink. "Mark, what is happening?" I just touched it, and it just came away. Julian looked up then. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. He looked older, his features sharpened by the loss of the frame that had made him look like a god. "The water," he rasped. "There's something in the water. My skin feels fine, but the hair, it's like it's not even attached anymore." I walked over to the counter and picked up one of the discarded clumps. It felt soft, lifeless. It's a fascinating phenomenon, isn't it? I said, my voice projecting a calm, academic interest. The way something so vital can become so fragile when the internal bonds are compromised. It's called systemic failure. In my line of work, we see it when a company's leadership loses its integrity. The external facade remains for a while, but the moment a little pressure is applied, the whole structure gives way. Sarah finally turned to look at me. The realization was visible in her eyes, a slow-motion dawning of the truth that was more satisfying than any outburst. "You," she said, her voice barely a breath. "You did this. You put something into Shampoo." "I didn't do anything that wasn't already earned, Sarah," I replied, leaning against the doorframe. "I simply introduced a variable that forced the truth to the surface. You want a life of secrets and shadows. I just brought a little light into the room. It's a shame about the dress, though. The green really highlights the areas where your hair used to be." Julian stood up, his fists clenching, but he looked pathetic in his state of partial baldness. "I'll call the police. You poison us. This is an assault." "Actually, Julian," I said, pulling a small, laminated card from my pocket, "I've had the contents of those bottles analyzed by an independent lab this morning, using the samples I kept for safety. There are no toxins, no harmful chemicals, just a high concentration of a specific enzyme found in various cosmetic treatments. Perfectly safe for the skin, but highly effective at dissolving protein bonds in dead tissue. Like hair, there is no injury here, no violence, just a very thorough, very expensive haircut. If you call the authorities, you'll have to explain why you were in my shower, using my products while I was supposedly out of town. And you'll have to do it while looking like that." Julian sank back onto the tub. He knew I was right. His career depended on his image, and that image was currently lying in the trash bin. He couldn't afford a scandal, especially one where he looked ridiculous. "I've spent the last few weeks doing a deep dive into the future planning folder on your tablet, Sarah," I continued, turning my attention back to my wife. "I found the documents you were preparing, the claims of my unstable behavior, the photos you took out of context. It was a very thorough attempt at character assassination. But you made a classic error in your risk assessment. You assumed I was the only one being watched." I reached into my suit jacket and pulled out a thick envelope. I tossed it onto the counter, right on top of the fallen hair. Inside that envelope, you'll find the financial records from the Contemporary Art Center. It turns out that flipping art and laundering money through ghost auctions is a federal offense. I've already shared a copy with the board of directors and the IRS. They were quite interested in the $3 million that seemed to vanish from the acquisitions fund over the last 2 years. Sarah's face went from pale to a ghostly, translucent white. "Mark, please, we can talk about this. I was doing that for us, for our future." "No, Sarah, you were doing that for Julian. I tracked the payments. You were sponsoring his lifestyle, his modeling career, and his luxury apartment downtown. You were using my name and my assets to fund a betrayal. That is a breach of contract that I cannot overlook." I turned to the door. "The movers will be here in 2 hours. Julian, I suggest you leave now. There's a hat in the hallway closet if you want to maintain a shred of dignity on your way out. Sarah, you have until the end of the day to vacate the premises. The house is being listed for sale tomorrow morning. Our joint accounts have been frozen pending a full audit of the stolen funds. You'll be hearing from my legal team regarding the divorce. Since you violated the infidelity clause and committed financial fraud, you'll find that the prenuptial agreement is now remarkably one-sided." I walked out of the suite, leaving them in the ruins of their vanity. As I descended the stairs, I felt a profound sense of lightness. The house, once a cage of lies, now felt like a clean, open space. I went into the kitchen and made a phone call. "This is Mark Stevens," I said when the call was answered. "I'd like to speak with the chairman of the board at the Arts Center." "Yes, it's about the emergency meeting. I have the additional documents he requested." By 4 o'clock that afternoon, the social destruction of Sarah Stevens was nearly complete. The gala of the year had been canceled. The board had issued a terse statement citing unforeseen financial discrepancies, and the immediate suspension of the head curator. The rumors were already spreading through the Austin elite like wildfire. People in those circles don't forgive a scandal that involved the IRS and the theft of public funds. Sarah wasn't just losing her husband. She was losing her world. I sat in my study, watching the sunset through the window. My phone was buzzing constantly, texts from friends, colleagues, and members of the press. I ignored them all. I was focused on the final data point, Julian West's social media. An hour ago, Julian had posted a frantic, poorly lit video claiming he was taking a sabbatical for health reasons. But someone, anonymously of course, had already leaked a grainy photo of him leaving my house that morning, wearing a baseball cap and looking gaunt and disheveled. The comments were brutal. His followers, who had worshipped his perfection, were now mocking his fall. His primary sponsor, a major athletic brand, had already scrubbed his image from their website. In the world of influencers, once the perfection is broken, the value drops to zero. I felt a quiet satisfaction. I hadn't raised a hand. I hadn't used a single bad word. I had simply applied the logic of the market to a fraudulent asset. I had liquidated the liability and protected the core. There was a knock at the door. It was the lead mover, a burly man who looked like he had seen everything. "Sir, the upstairs rooms are cleared out. The lady left about 20 minutes ago." She didn't say much. "Thank you," I said, handing him a generous tip. "Please make sure the locks are changed on your way out. The new codes are in the file I gave you." "You got it, Mr. Stevens. Sorry about the mess up there. Never seen anything like it." "Neither have I." I lied smoothly. "It's been a very strange day." When the movers left, I walked through the empty house. The silence was absolute. The unseen guest was gone. The smell of sandalwood and deceit had been replaced by the scent of fresh air and floor wax. I went into the master bathroom and looked at the shower. The frosted glass was clean. The bottles were gone. The marble was white and cold. I thought about the future planning folder one last time. Sarah had wanted to paint me as a man who had lost his mind. Instead, I had shown her a man who had found his clarity. I wasn't the one hiding in the dark. I wasn't the one stealing from my partners. I was the one who kept the books balanced. I went downstairs and poured myself a final drink, a simple, high-quality bourbon. I sat on the back patio and watched the stars come out over Texas. The heat of the day was fading, replaced by the cool, dry air of the evening. I felt a sense of equilibrium that I hadn't felt in years. Tomorrow, I would start the process of selling the house. I would move to a smaller place, something more efficient, more logical. I would continue my work, analyzing risks and identifying failure points for people who actually valued the truth. I would be fine, better than fine. I would be free. The next morning, the local newspaper carried a small headline on the business page. "Local art gallery faces federal audit. Top curator dismissed." There was no mention of me. There was no mention of the shampoo. The world only saw the financial collapse, the logical consequence of a life built on fraud. Sarah was now a pariah, facing a mountain of legal debt and a reputation that was beyond repair. Julian was a ghost, a has-been before he had even become a was. I closed the paper and finished my breakfast. The sun was bright. The sky was a clear, piercing blue. I picked up my briefcase and headed to the door. I had a meeting at 10 o'clock with a new client, a tech firm that wanted to ensure their internal structures were sound before a major IPO. They wanted an analyst who could see the hidden risks. They wanted someone who understood that the most dangerous threats aren't the ones that come from the outside, but the ones that grow in the silence of the house. I smiled as I stepped out into the morning air. I was exactly the man for the job. I drove through the gated community, passing the identical lawns and the perfect houses. I realized then that I didn't belong here anymore. I didn't need the facade. I didn't need the performance. I only needed the truth, and the truth was that I had one, not through force, but through the patient application of reality. As I reached the main road, I saw a billboard for the athletic brand Julian had once represented. They had already replaced his image with a new model. Someone younger, someone with a full head of hair and a look of naive confidence. I chuckled to myself. The cycle continues. The market always finds a replacement for a depreciated asset. But I wasn't a depreciating asset. I was the one who calculated the value. I was the one who set the price. And as I merged into the morning traffic, I knew that for the first time in my life, I was playing the game on my own terms. The story of Mark and Sarah Stevens was over. The records were closed. The audit was complete. And as the city of Austin blurred past my window, I looked forward to the next set of data, the next challenge, and the next opportunity to restore balance to a world that so desperately needed it. I reached my office building and parked in my reserved spot. I walked through the lobby, receiving nods of respect from the staff. I was Mark Stevens, the man who saw what others missed. I was the analyst of the invisible. And as I entered my office and opened my laptop, I felt a sense of profound, quiet power. The first entry in my new journal was simple, written in a clear, precise hand. Day 1. System status, optimal. All variables accounted for. I began my work, the hum of the city a distant, manageable background noise. I was no longer looking for anomalies in my own life. I was looking for them in the world at large. And I knew, with a certainty that only a risk analyst can feel, that I would find them. Because the truth is always there, hidden in the data, waiting for someone with the patience and the cold, clear eyes to see it. And I was that man. I would always be that man. The price of deceit had been paid in full, and I was the one who had collected the debt. It was a good day to be an analyst. It was a good day to be alive. The final chapter of my reconstruction was almost complete. I had one last meeting, one last signature, and then the past would be nothing more than a footnote in a very long and successful career. I looked at the clock. It was time. I stood up, straightened my tie, and walked toward the conference room. I was ready. The future was waiting, and for the first time, it was a future of my own making. Everything was in its place. Everything was exactly as it should be. The equilibrium was restored. The final audit of a life is not a single event, but a series of quiet and devastating realizations. In my profession, we call it the settlement phase. It is the moment when all the claims have been filed, all the evidence has been scrutinized, and the final balance is struck. There is no room for emotion in a settlement. There is only the cold, hard reality of what is owed and what has been lost. I sat in the back of a black car, watching the familiar streets of Austin slide past the window like a film reel of a previous life. The courthouse was a grand, limestone structure that projected an image of eternal stability, but I knew better. I knew that inside those walls, lives were dismantled and rebuilt every hour of every day. I was there to oversee the final demolition of the structure I had once called a marriage. I stepped out of the car and adjusted my tie. The air was thick with the scent of upcoming rain and the hum of the city. I felt a profound sense of detachment. I was the architect of this day, the one who had gathered the data and calculated the risks. And now I was simply here to witness the execution of the plan. I walked up the steps, my shoes clicking against the stone with a rhythmic precision that mirrored my pulse. Inside, the courthouse was a cathedral of bureaucracy. I found the designated courtroom and took my seat. My attorney, a man named Henderson who specialized in the high-net-worth dissolutions of the elite, gave me a brief, professional nod. Sarah arrived 10 minutes later. She was accompanied by a lawyer who looked like he hadn't slept in a week. She was wearing a wide-brimmed hat and a scarf, but as she took her seat across the aisle, she was forced to remove them. I watched her with the same analytical gaze I would use to study a failing asset. She was wearing a high-quality wig, a synthetic imitation of the hair she had lost, but it was slightly off. The color was too uniform, the texture too perfect. It looked like a mask. Her face was gaunt, her eyes shadowed by the weight of the social and legal storm that had broken over her. She didn't look at me. She couldn't. The proceedings began with the clinical efficiency that I have always admired in the legal system. Henderson presented the first set of evidence, the digital logs of the house. He spoke about the breach of the infidelity clause with the detached tone of a man reading a weather report. He showed the court the LiDAR data, the time-stamped entries of Julian West, and the recordings from the master bathroom. I watched the judge's face. Judge Miller was a woman who had seen the worst of human nature, but even she seemed taken aback by the sheer arrogance of the deception. The unseen guest was no longer a ghost. He was a documented reality, a recurring line item in a ledger of betrayal. Then came the financial audit. This was the part of the plan that I had spent the most time perfecting. Henderson laid out the records from the Contemporary Art Center. He showed the ghost auctions, the missing acquisitions, and the direct links between the gallery's accounts and Julian West's lifestyle. He presented the evidence of Sarah's future planning folder, the systematic attempt to frame me for a mental collapse. As the documents were entered into the record, I saw Sarah's lawyer lean back and close his eyes. He knew. They both knew that there was no defense for this level of premeditated fraud. The judge's ruling was as swift as it was absolute. Because the breach of contract was tied to criminal financial activity and a documented conspiracy to commit perjury, the prenuptial agreement was upheld in its most restrictive form. Sarah was entitled to nothing from the estate. Furthermore, the court ordered a freeze on all her remaining personal assets pending the outcome of the federal investigation into the gallery's finances. She was being stripped of her wealth, her reputation, and her future in a single 30-minute session. When the hearing adjourned, Sarah stood up slowly. She looked like a ghost of the woman I had married. She turned to look at me then, her eyes filled with a mixture of hatred and a desperate, lingering confusion. "You planned this," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the courtroom clearing out. "You didn't just want a divorce. You wanted to destroy me." I stood up and smoothed the front of my jacket. I looked at her, and for the first time in years, I felt a sense of complete and total equilibrium. "I didn't destroy anything, Sarah. I simply allowed the consequences of your actions to reach their logical conclusion. You were the one who breached the contract. I was just the one who audited the books. You chose vanity over integrity, and now you're experiencing the market correction." She turned away and walked out of the room, her wig slightly askew, her head bowed. I watched her go, and I felt nothing but a quiet professional satisfaction. The liability had been liquidated. The social erasure of Julian West was even more efficient. A week after the hearing, I received a final report from the private investigator. Julian had been dropped by every major agency. The video of him hiding in my shower had become a viral cautionary tale in the industry. Without his hair and without his reputation for being the perfect man, he was nothing. He had attempted to sue me for emotional distress, but the case was laughed out of court before it even reached a preliminary hearing. He was now living in a small apartment on the outskirts of the city, working a job that didn't require him to be in front of camera. He was a non-entity, a data point that had been erased from the system. The Contemporary Art Center faced its own reckoning. The board had been forced to declare bankruptcy after the full extent of the fraud was revealed. The ghost auctions had triggered a federal inquiry that led to the recovery of several stolen pieces. I was hailed as a whistleblower, the man who had the courage to expose the corruption in the heart of the Austin art scene. I was invited to speak at several prestigious events, but I declined. I wasn't interested in the spotlight. I was interested in the peace that comes from a well-executed plan. I spent the next month finalizing the sale of the house. It was a beautiful structure, but it was a structure built on a foundation of lies. I didn't want to live in a monument to a failure. I sold it to a young tech entrepreneur who saw only the glass and the steel and the smart features. I didn't tell him about the sensors. I didn't tell him about the LiDAR or the hidden cameras. I let him believe it was just a house. On the day I moved out, I walked through the rooms one last time. The movers had taken everything. The walls were white and empty. The marble was cold and silent. I went up to the master bathroom and looked at the shower. It was just a shower now. The frosted glass was clear of steam. The scent of bergamot was gone. I felt a sense of closure that was almost physical. I had entered this house as a man who was being manipulated, and I was leaving it as a man who had taken back control of his own narrative. I drove to my new apartment, a minimalist space on the top floor of a downtown high-rise. It was a place of straight lines and clear views. There was no smart home system here. I didn't need it. I was no longer an observer of my own life. I was the active participant. I had a new office, a new client list, and a new sense of purpose. My reputation as a risk analyst had reached new heights. People came to me not just for the numbers, but for the insight. They wanted to know how to see the things that others missed. I sat on my new balcony, watching the lights of Austin flicker on. The city looked like a vast, complex grid of probabilities. I saw the movement of the traffic, the flow of the energy, the constant pulse of a million different lives. I thought about Sarah and Julian, and I realized that they were already becoming footnotes in my memory. They were the anomalies that had been corrected, the noise that had been filtered out. In my world, we talk about the long-term sustainability of a system. A system that is built on deception is inherently unstable. It may look impressive for a while, but eventually, the internal pressures will cause it to collapse. My marriage was such a system. The collapse was inevitable. I had simply been the one to manage the failure in a way that protected my own interests. I took a sip of a very expensive, very smooth bourbon and felt the warmth of it in my chest. I looked at the stars, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't try to calculate their distance or their brightness. I just looked at them. I was no longer worried about the black swan, events, or the hidden risks. I had proven that I could handle whatever the world threw at me. I had audited the truth, and I had come out on top. The final signature on the divorce papers arrived in the mail the following day. I signed it without hesitation. The contract was closed. The settlement was complete. I walked to my office, feeling the sun on my face. I had a meeting with a new client at 10, a group that was looking to reorganize their entire structure from the ground up. They wanted honesty. They wanted clarity. They wanted me. I walked through the lobby of my building, acknowledging the greetings of the staff with a polite, confident smile. I was Mark Stevens. I was the man who saw the truth. I was the analyst of reality. And as I stepped into the elevator and watched the doors close, I knew that the future was no longer a risk to be managed. It was an asset to be enjoyed. The price of deceit had been paid, and the books were finally balanced. I was free. I was successful. And most importantly, I was exactly who I was meant to be. The story of the house in the hills was over, and a new, much more interesting chapter was just beginning. I looked at my reflection in the polished metal of the elevator doors and saw a man who was ready for anything. The world was full of variables, and I was the one who knew how to solve for X. I stepped out of the elevator and walked into my office. The air was fresh, the light was bright, and the data was waiting. I opened my laptop and began my work. There was a world of risks to analyze, and I was the best man for the job. My life was no longer a data point in someone else's plan. It was my own masterpiece of logic and clarity. And as I began the first audit of my new life, I knew that this time, the results would be perfect. The equilibrium was not just restored, it was improved. I was home, not in a building of glass and steel, but in the quiet, steady confidence of a man who knows the truth and knows how to use it. The journey was complete. The mission was accomplished. The past was settled. And the future? The future was looking very, very good.